With the NHL draft and free agency now behind us, teams are beginning to gear up for the start of the 2024-25 season. Some teams that were good last year are chomping at the bit to get another crack at the Stanley Cup. Some teams that were on the upswing last year are hoping to take the next step, and other teams are hoping to stave off the inevitable decline for just another year. Having gone through all 32 rosters, I believe that there are 5 teams who stand out as being on the verge of making a leap in the upcoming season. These are teams that generally finish towards the middle or bottom of the standings last year, who made big moves this offseason that I believe will help carry them either into the playoffs or into the upper echelons of the NHL. Now, while I base these off of my point projections for each team compared to how they finished last year, these aren't going in order of who's making the biggest leap versus the smallest, but rather I'm starting the list with the teams who kind of made obvious improvements that everybody thinks are going to be better this year, and ending with the teams that kind of surprised me with how much I think they have improved compared to the previous season. But before we talk about those 5 teams, I do have one honorable mention, and that is the Chicago Blackhawks. The Blackhawks were one of the worst teams in the entire NHL last year, so just by sheer odds, they're probably going to be better this year. In addition, last year they had some pretty horrible injury luck, losing Taylor Hall for the whole year. Connor Bedard missed a good chunk of time. They had a very strong draft. I really like the additions of Tyler Bertuzzi and Teuvo Teravainen on the top line to go along with Bedard, and they added some really good experience to the back end with TJ Brody and Alec Martinez. Even though those two are probably going to play on the second and third pairing, I like that as an upgrade over what they had last year. That's going to provide a lot of value. Now, the first team I think is set for a big improvement in 2024-25 is no surprise to anybody. The Nashville Predators made some huge upgrades in the offseason, taking some big swings with the signings of Steven Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault, and Brady Shea. They also locked up UC Saros to a long-term extension, which might age badly, but for right now, UC Saros is one of the elite goaltenders in the NHL, so keeping him in Nashville while they have this window to go for a cup is a good move in my opinion. And in my opinion, all these moves have moved Nashville from a kind of fringe bottom-tier playoff team, which they were last year, to being among the true Stanley Cup threats out of the Western Conference. I think that this team is really stacked, particularly on the back end and in goal, which is how you always want to build your teams. Sure, you can say that the bottom 6 forwards are a little bit weaker than most teams in the West, and their top scorers are a little bit on the older side, but I really like what Andrew Brunette and Barry Trotz are doing in Nashville. They identified that they have a really strong core, and they're going to go for it. Now, the second team that I think is going to make a big leap in 2024-25 is also not going to be a surprise to anybody, but is for a different reason than the Nashville Predators. The New Jersey Devils were a bad team last year, and it was a surprise to almost everybody because most people had them pegged as a Stanley Cup contender, and frankly, they should have been. This team was done in by bad coaching and even worse goaltending, 2 problems that they appear to have solved this offseason by hiring Sheldon Keefe and acquiring Jacob Markstrom. Even though I don't love the idea behind the trade, I think that Jacob Markstrom is not an elite goaltender and they kind of overpaid by giving up Kevin Ball to get him. It's understandable that Tom Fitzgerald did so after goaltending did in the Devils so badly last year. They were also dealing with a ton of injuries last year. Hughes and Hischier were both out for extended periods. And so other than trading for Markstrom, they also signed Tomas Tatar and Brendan Dillon for the back end. These are some low risk in positions of need, but in truth, the Devils have a very good core going forward with Hughes, with Hischier, with Jesper Bratt, Dawson Mercer, Dougie Hamilton on the back end, and Luke Hughes developing. It would take another act of God for the New Jersey Devils to not be one of the top teams in the East. Now we start getting into the more controversial takes. My next team that I think is poised for a big jump this offseason is one that's going to hurt a certain fan base, and that's the Utah Hockey Club. Arizona Coyotes fans must be pissed to see that the second this team left for Utah, they immediately started getting aggressive, trading for Mikhail Sergachev and signing John Marino. This is in addition to a pretty good young core they have with Logan Cooley, Clayton Keller, Dylan Guenther, Sean Durzi on the back end, and Connor Ingram in goal. I don't know if Utah is a playoff team this year, but I think they're going to take a step forward and be a team that's at least in the conversation late in the season, then probably sputter and run out of gas just before the final playoff push. But the future does look bright in Utah, much brighter than it did in Arizona. Sorry, Coyotes fans. Now, the fourth team that I think is poised for a big step forward in the 2024-25 season is the Seattle Kraken. The Kraken were kind of an odd team the last couple of years. They made the playoffs and won a round in 2022-23, even though they weren't really that good a team. And then last year, they kind of came back down to earth. They finally wised up that Dave Axtell is a pretty bad coach, but then they hired Dan Bilesma to replace him, which is like a great hire if this was the year 2011. But Seattle's kind of like Utah. They have a good young core that's developing in Matty Beniers, Shane Wright, and they're now augmenting that core, making 2 big swings in free agency. The Braden Montour signing, I think, is a very good one. He's one of the premier puck-moving offensive defensemen in the NHL. He adds a jolt to that backline that they desperately needed, and they also spent big on Chandler Stevenson. Now, I think it's pretty well established that most people think that this contract is going to age terribly, and I agree with that. For right now, though, I think that Chandler Stevenson is only a little bit overpaid for the value of his contract. He's still a pretty good scorer. He's a good 2A player. He stabilizes your middle six. He can play on the PK and the power play. This contract will probably be bought out at some point, but I think for the first 3 or 4 years, the Kraken will make great use out of Chandler Stevenson. And then the 5th and final team, I think, is poised for a big jump. I actually had to double check the projections twice on this one because I kind of didn't believe it. But I think the Ottawa Senators are considerably better this year than they were last year. First of all, getting Linus Ullmark in between the pipes as opposed to Jonas Korpisalo is like a 10-point standing swing. One of those guys has shown himself to be a Vezina caliber goaltender and is still in the prime of his career, and the other is Jonas Korpisalo. But even beyond that, I really love the Ottawa Senators' top 6. Guys like Tkachuk, Batherson, Stützle, and Shane Pinto, who they managed to bring back, are going to take another step forward this season. I really love the additions of David Perron and Michael Amadio for the 3rd line. Perron's the one that I think the Ottawa fans are a bit more concerned about because of his age, but he's still proven to be a very effective middle 6 player, and the Amadio deal, I think, is a very fair value contract. And all of that combines to give the Ottawa Senators a sneaky good forward core, in my opinion. Now, the problem for the Senators is going to be on the back line. Yes, they still have Jake Sanderson, but they lost Jacob Chikrin, flipping him for Nick Jensen, who, as somebody who's watched him for the last few years, is just not very good anymore. You're hoping that Artem Zub will take a step forward this year, and that guys like Tyler Klevin and Jacob Bernard-Docker are going to be able to at least be serviceable on the bottom pairing. But even still, I think that Ottawa's back end is at least serviceable enough, and their forward core is so good and so deep. Ottawa avoids the injury bug. I actually think they have a legitimate chance to be a wildcard team in the East this year, especially considering how the Bruins and the Panthers, 2 teams in their own division, have lost so much talent to free agency.